There we go. Let's get started then. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Kirsty Livingston and I'm the Head of Membership Services and Strategic Partnerships at IoD Scotland. So thank you so much for giving up your time to join us for this afternoon's webinar, which is called COVID-19 Impact on the Scottish Economy. And I'm delighted to welcome Mary Sporage, who's the Deputy Director at the Fraser of Allander Institute. She's going to outline the latest trends in the global, UK and Scottish economies, and also share some of the pertinent points from the recent analysis that was published yesterday. So thank you so much, Mary, for your time. What we're going to do is if everybody could just go on mute for just now, that'd be fantastic. And if you want to post any questions you might have in the chat column, we'll get to these at the end, or any comments, and I'm going to record and share the session afterwards. So over to you, Mary. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, and thank you very much for asking me to speak today. You may have seen some coverage of the stuff that we've published over the last day or so. I hope you find this session interesting. And as Kirsty said, if you do have any comments or any questions that you want to ask, then just put them in the chat and we'll get to them after I go through just a few slides. It's worth saying that we published a large amount of material in the last few days, and it's going to keep coming over the next couple of days. So if you are interested, you can have a look at our website and see all of the information that we've published. So firstly, in case you're not familiar with it, with the Institute or with what we publish, the Fraser of Allander Institute is an economic research institute based in the University of Strathclyde's Economics Department. So we do a lot of what we hope is policy relevant research to inform the Parliament, the public and so on about the economic debates that are going on in the country. So I am not an academic. I'm very much my background's in policy making and policy analysis. So what we hope is that what we do is actually useful and impactful. So our economic commentary has been published since the Institute was set up in 1975, and actually this one is 45 years ago was the first one that we published. So this is quite an important milestone for us as an organisation. This edition of the commentary itself was supported by a number of different articles that we put out at the same time. So there was a piece by the retiring Auditor General, Caroline Gardner, on the challenges to Scotland's public finances posed by the pandemic. We also published yesterday's views of, it says around a dozen, but it was actually 17 experts on the Scottish economy, on the outlook for Scotland given the current crisis, which is quite an interesting read. Lots of different views there about what might happen next to the Scottish economy. We also published today an article by Professor Ross Brown at St Andrews University about the impact on small and medium enterprises in Scotland. And then there's a number of articles coming out today and tomorrow on the impact of the pandemic on poverty in Scotland and the impacts potentially on the Scottish budget. So if you'd like to pick up any aspects of these particular policy areas, I'd be happy to discuss them with you in the questions. So a huge amount of material has come out, but I'm going to just discuss a wee bit about what we're actually covering in the main commentary document itself and what our main sort of findings were. So, I mean, it won't surprise any of you to hear that we've said that the economy is now in the deepest recession in living memory. And we've been asked a lot about how alarmed we should be about the sorts of contractions we've seen in the economy during March and April. What we've said is that this output contraction is largely artificial. And what we mean by that is it should be entirely expected given the sectors of the economy that we've mothballed in order to protect public health, particularly during April when the lockdown was probably at its most severe. So if we hadn't seen this contraction in output, something would be going really wrong because large parts of the economy have been shut down. They're not taking in income, they're not having turnover, therefore we would have expected this sort of fall in output. And indeed, estimates that we produced earlier in April were for about this sort of scale of contraction for that reason. But what really matters for the health of our economy is how quickly we bounce back. All the signs are that the initial hopes of a very quick bounce back in the economy are very optimistic. All the signs are that there's going to be some scarring, and it will take some time for the economy to recover to whatever this new normal is that we have to now get used to. It's worth saying as well that as government measures to support employment in particular are rolled back, such as the job retention scheme, we're likely to see the full scale of the crisis hit home on people's real lives. So just as the economy might be returning to growth because sectors of the economy that have been mothballed are coming out of being mothballed and starting to operate again, albeit at limited capacity. So just as the economy is growing, what we're likely to see is a large rise in unemployment as companies who have been supported by the job retention scheme may find it need to reduce their workforce as that measure is rolled back, or perhaps can't operate at all at this lower level of capacity. So are these businesses still viable potentially as they have to operate without government support? And the scale of that, we've been asked a lot, how many people who are currently on furlough may ultimately lose their jobs is really difficult to answer. But there's definitely going to be a significant percentage of that workforce which is ultimately laid off during this crisis. And whilst we're hearing a lot from different policymakers and different pressure groups about how to reimagine the economy, how to think about it in a different way, do we want to have the same sort of economy we did prior to the crisis? This is all very important and very good to talk about during a crisis if we can do things better in the future. But what can't be overestimated is the importance of a prosperous economy for everybody's well-being. Without a good standard of living, it's very difficult to talk about other things in terms of, people's happiness or people's security. These are very important things, but if we don't have a good standard of living and a prosperous economy, it's very difficult to achieve those other aims. What we've said is that we think there are 4 key priorities for policymakers to think about through the restart, some of which have changed so much even in the last couple of days. One of the things about this crisis is I have never, in all of my years of being around the government and policy making, seen things move so quickly. And as soon as you publish something, it's out of date. However, this is what we said when we published yesterday. The first thing is that it is crucially important to avoid a second wave of infections. As you'll see when we come on to talk about the various scenarios that we've set out for how the economy may evolve, the most damaging one is where we have a second wave of infection, which leads to a second shutdown in the economy. That is the most damaging outcome. So it's important that this is avoided at all costs. Secondly, obviously, this is what's evolved so much in the last day or so. The government needs to develop this effective plan for the safe return of schools. So this is not only to let parents return to work, but also if they hadn't had this in place and there was some sort of form of part-time schooling, it's likely that this could underlie and exacerbate some inequalities that we see in our labour market already, given that the burden of childcare generally would fall on women. All the evidence shows that, and therefore there would be some issues perhaps about exacerbating inequalities in our workforce and our society. The third thing is policymakers need to think about the way that support measures can persist as restrictions persist. So for particular sectors, for example, are going to be under much more restriction than others. And can targeted policy measures be put in place in order to support those sectors while restrictions are still there? The timing is really important here. Businesses only have very limited cash reserves, particularly in some sectors that are dominated by small businesses. So we are talking, if they get this wrong by a matter of weeks, there'll be a lot of businesses that will go to the wall in that period because they have very limited cash reserves. And fourthly, and really importantly, a lot will depend on how consumers react to the easing of restrictions. All of these businesses can open up, hospitality, pubs and restaurants, and we've heard a lot about that in the last 24 hours in terms of when they'll be able to open up. But will people actually want to go? And there are 2 aspects to this. There is obviously the health aspect where people might be anxious about, contracting the virus and what they would take home to their family and their more vulnerable members of society. But there's also a larger worry about spending money right now. If somebody has been on furlough or perhaps had their hours reduced or seen a drop in their income, they're going to be more wary about spending their money. And so they're more likely to cut back on discretionary spending. So these two aspects may combine, health worries with wider economic conditions to lead to quite a depression on consumer spending over the next year. And that might be the level of that sort of depression on consumer spending may determine how quickly we recover to kind of pre-crisis levels that we were more used to. So just delving in a wee bit to the detail in the report, we cover a lot, but I'm just going to talk about a few particular issues. If we think about the global economy, obviously this has hit across the world, and it's hit different countries at different times, and they've had different levels of sort of economic impact as a result. And we can see in a number of countries where it hit kind of early on are starting to come out of that, albeit there are some obviously surges in infections in some of the countries that had that very early, like China. But interestingly, when we look across all of the countries and we think about the performance of the economies over 2020 as a whole, the UK is generally thought to be particularly badly hit. And there are kind of three reasons for this. One was the general rate of infection that there was in the UK, which compared to some other countries was particularly high. The second of those is the mix of both the types of workforce we have in the UK, quite a lot of informal labour and labour on more precarious contracts, plus the sort of sectors that we have in our economy, more prevalence of the sectors that are likely to be most severely hit. And thirdly is Brexit and the looming exit from the transition period in January, which is causing, in forecasters' view, more uncertainty because we don't quite yet know what that's going to look like in January when we leave. And given global supply chains have been severely disrupted, the general thought amongst the economic community is this further disruption may mean that the UK is more badly hit than some other countries. Overall, there's not like a massive amount of economic data at the moment about the quarter we're currently in, obviously, but there's stress clearly evident in the global economy. World trade has contracted sharply, as you would expect, as the movement of goods is suppressed and economies are sort of contracting and shut down. The oil price is tracking at quite a low level, between $30 and $40 a barrel. And as demand for oil has fallen off a cliff, it's likely to remain very low for a long time to come. And obviously we've seen things like air passenger traffic completely collapse. And I think generally the thought is that this industry it's going to be very different as we emerge from this. It's going to never be the same again, and it's certainly going to be completely transformed by this crisis. So turning now to the Scottish and UK economies. As I said, our initial estimates that would be around a quarter of the economy would be displaced by the lockdown measures. And the data in the last couple of weeks from both the UK and Scotland has suggested that this was probably about right. So we saw in April, for example, the Scottish economy contracted by 19%, UK economy 20%, just sort of what we would have expected given the scale of the lockdown, as I said. There was a lot of hysteria about these estimates when they were published, I felt. But as I say, this is exactly what they should be showing. Or they wouldn't be very good measures of economic activity. I mean, the really kind of stark thing about the figures is the sectoral differences. So you see accommodation food services, which is hotels, restaurants, bars, and so on, has contracted 85% since February. And that just shows the scale of the lockdown in that sector, with the vast majority of businesses being mothballed. And presumably they're furloughing their staff or trying to get some sort of self-employment support to get them through. So the sectoral differences are both important from a kind of an economic point of view, but also when you think about the sorts of people who tend to work in these sectors and the sorts of regions of Scotland which may be most affected by these particular sectors being so badly affected. And these are the sectors that are going to take the longest to recover as well. We can talk about the recovery, which we will in a second, at the kind of macro level, but it's only when you get under that you see that some sectors are going to take a really long time to recover from this, if they ever do. And if we think about the labour market, recent data published showed that the Scottish unemployment had risen during April, but still to quite a low level, historically speaking. But a lot of this is in the post, and it's coming as the job retention scheme is unwound. So they don't really show the extent of the crisis. So it's only if you look at other measures which start to give you a flavour of what might be coming. So for example, if you look at hours worked, that has deteriorated sharply. Now that's actual hours worked, so it will include everyone who's on furlough, not working. So you would expect to see a sharp decline in that. But if you look at things like vacancy rates, numbers of vacancies, those have deteriorated sharply. And it shows the sorts of reassessment of workforce needs that companies are going through and the sorts of levels of decline we might be seeing in the labour market in the months to come. So some concerning early indicators for that, although it is kind of what we're expecting, that unemployment could rise significantly. At the moment it's around 4.5%, and some estimate that it could go up to as high as something like 10%. There are a lot of really useful new measures that are coming out in order to understand the position of businesses more immediately than the sort of traditional economic data can do. These lockdown measures have meant a lot of businesses have had to rely on their cash reserves, as I've already mentioned. And there's some quite concerning data that shows that a lot of firms don't have very much cash that will do them, for the next 3 to 6 months. So this survey, for example, found that just over a third of Scottish businesses have cash reserves to do them more than 6 months. So there's a lot of businesses who have very little cash, and if you look at the sort of split by small businesses, they're much less likely to have the cash reserves to see them through. So this is obviously a worry as some of the government support measures start to get unwound. And I suppose we should remember that whilst the government support measures have covered perhaps grants through the business rates system and support for employment payments, they haven't necessarily covered other things like rent and so on, which is obviously a big issue for many businesses. So just turning to the outlook for growth in Scotland, and this was an area that got quite a lot of coverage when we published this report yesterday. We put out 3 scenarios for growth. There's one that's our central one, which is the red line there, which shows the sort of the size of the economy compared to our pre-lockdown period. And what that suggests is that it will be it'll be about 2.5 years before we get back to pre-crisis levels of the economy, probably late 2022 before we're getting back to that sort of level. In a more optimistic scenario, and I will say the central scenario is based on the latest business view on what's going to happen over the next wee while as they are able to open up again. Slightly more optimistic, if things start to happen a little bit faster than maybe we thought about a week ago when we put these scenarios together, and certainly things have moved faster than we thought they would a week ago over the last couple of days in terms of opening up the economy and schools and things like that. And perhaps we'll see a faster bounce back than we were expecting. But still, we can't underestimate the capacity constraints some businesses will be operating under, and the scanning that will happen as people lose their jobs and have to find new ones. This will still act as a drag on growth. So we're not going to see a V-shaped recession, as it's called. There will be some time that will be taken to bounce back. So then we estimate it might take till early 2022 to get back to pre-crisis levels. But the most severe impact is if there's a second wave and lockdown restrictions have to be reimposed. And under that scenario, we estimate it could be as long as mid-2024 before we get back to pre-crisis levels of growth. It's worth saying, I was asked yesterday that whether we were saying there would be a 4-year recession if there was a second wave. And just to be clear, that's not what this shows. What it shows is it will take, if there's a second wave, we've estimated it will take 4 years to get back to the size of the economy we had previously. We will obviously be growing, the economy will be growing, it just will have taken such a hit twice that is likely to be growing quite slowly for quite a long period of time, which will mean it will take a long time to make up all of that output that we've lost. Excuse me. So we've also got a bit of analysis in the report about the impact on individuals. We've talked about the labour market and some of the issues that might be coming down the road. And it's clear that shutting down the economy has impacted severely on households and different people, but the impacts haven't been felt in the same way by all different households and different sorts of people. Low earners have been hardest hit, and they're most likely to be in the sectors that are shut down, such as the hospitality sector. Also young people and women dominate in these industries. So they're all people who, in general, are hardest hit during recessions. And the sectoral differences that this crisis has hit, the way it's hit differently in different sectors, has exacerbated those issues of these being the people who are most severely impacted. Even with the restart happening, as I've said, we're likely to see things get worse before they get better. And you can see from this chart shows new universal credit claims in Scotland, and there's been over 200,000 new claimants in Scotland since the crisis began, which is fairly unprecedented. So you can see a lot of people are struggling in Scotland, and they're likely to be the people who were most vulnerable before the crisis began. We do significant amounts of analysis of the hospitality sector and showing different characteristics of people in the sector. And we also do an interesting analysis of key workers in the different sectors that they tend to be working in. Again, they tend to be quite female dominated and low paid sectors. And one of the interesting things about this crisis has been a discussion about the way these sorts of workers are valued. And it will be interesting to see how this translates into perhaps their wages in the future if we re-evaluate the importance of, for example, transportation workers or social care workers in particular. So I think that's all I wanted to cover, just to give you a flavour of what we were talking about in the report, but I'd be happy to take any questions anybody has.
Thanks so much, Mary. That was fantastic. There's lots of commentary, so I won't go read everything, but I'll take some of the questions. So Aidan had a good question. Is there any data on how productivity has been affected by so many working from home, and has it actually gone up as it has in my own business?
It's a really great question, and there's lots of people, and I know there's a lot of companies who are doing a lot of surveying of their employees at the moment to see if that's the case. I think it's probably different for different individuals, dependent on their circumstances, obviously. People who have had to juggle homeschooling with work may say that their productivity hasn't been great. I guess there are some wider kind of mental health issues about isolation and these sorts of things that may have to be considered about people working from home on a full-time basis all the time. But there are also many companies who I think clearly won't go back to the way they were working before, and may actually have sort of said, why do we need this office and this expensive office in the city centre when we're operating very productively, the way we have been. And I think our workplace, just like many others, is likely to, whilst not go back to, we won't go back the way we were before. I think there will be a mixture of working, much more of a mixture from working from home and working in the office than we have in the past. So I think there isn't any data yet, but I think it's going to be a topic of a lot of research in the months to come. Particularly as companies reevaluate their floor space and their offices and what they actually need, because buildings are expensive, and if they can reduce the floor space they have, then I think a lot of companies will be looking at that, particularly if they feel like they've operated effectively throughout the crisis. It could be a real circuit breaker for the way we work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just wondering, a smaller group, whether some of the guests want to ask some questions. So Val, you put up a few points. Do you want to share your views and the questions for Mary?
Okay, yeah. I was basically, I think my comment is that if we continue to measure GDP just on growth, if we use GDP as a measurement of growth and success, we're destined to carry on with the system, which, if we link it to the climate change agenda, is going to take us down a downward path. There's going to be lots of people available for work, and is now the time where we can use the real innovation that we see in Scotland to build something different. So rather than seeing unemployment as a problem and continue to do this, is how do we create actually a better society? So a society where, you know, we're not consuming because we're addicted, you know, so that we're using resources wisely and building a better place. I've just come off a Zoom call with somebody who does something called City Farm Systems, which is actually designed to put greenhouses on the top of supermarkets to actually grow food there rather than ship it from miles away. And so there's lots and lots. This you know, this time is creating a capacity to think differently, and I think we need to hold on to it, not just want to go back to life as it was before, because life as it was before is not sustainable.
And yes, that's absolutely true. You know, there's a lot of people who would agree with, you know, the sort of way that we recovered from the last recession, and the sorts of jobs we created, and the precarious nature of a lot of the employment that was created, which has led to a generation of young people who are likely to be worse off than their parents. And it's left them in quite precarious situations as we go into another economic crisis. And you know, so there are a lot of questions about whether we have the right sort of economic model, and whether we should look at something that's a bit different. I see what you're saying about in the chat about universal basic income as well. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about this in the wake of this, whether, given that we introduced the furlough scheme as a response to this crisis, had the time of universal basic income come. There was also the response from the Chancellor to the crisis of increasing universal credit, because it was seen as, you know, the safety net wasn't sort of high enough in terms of ensuring a minimum income. I think what I'd say about basic income is that it depends what you're trying to achieve with it. Because if you're looking to provide a minimum income standard like universal credit, then that's at one level. If you're looking to provide the flexibility for people to move between careers, then that's more of an unemployment insurance type model, which is quite different again. The trouble with the furlough scheme as it is at the moment is that it's kind of, if it's extended, it will kind of keep people in jobs where there might not be a job for them in the future, for the foreseeable future. So it does need to evolve into something different, probably, for retraining and thinking about the way our economy might work in the future. Dealing with your points more directly that you've made, an UBI is fantastically expensive. So you also need to work out both what you want to achieve and how you're going to pay for it. It's like double the Scottish Government budget right now. So it's fantastically expensive if you set it at a level that's a real basic income. Dealing with your points more directly, I think it's a good point about how we're going to spend government money and how we're going to build build economic development. There's been a real gutting of local government budgets, and less of an ability for local economic development to happen. And perhaps the focus should be more on community and local economic development, because a lot of people have used local suppliers, local businesses during this crisis. And it will be interesting to see how much that kind of persists as we return to normal. And will we go back to our old ways, or will we keep buying local on these sorts of things? Sorry, I'm going to have some more. Welcome,
you,
Dale.
Val. Thank you, Mary. That was really, really useful. Thank you. Lawrence, you had a point because you're an SME in the hospitality sector. Do you want to explain a little bit about your question?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for myself and a number of other people I know in the hospitality sector, we are so dependent on what other people do. What people, will they book hotels? Will they go out to restaurants? Will they come back in these numbers that we need them to come back? I work in offices, so I'm very dependent on how many people come back into the office. Also, if you take the Highland, I know that in the Highland community, there's a bit of a battle at the moment going on between hoteliers and all the rest of it and local people. How are local people in the Highlands going to respond to an influx of people suddenly doing the North Coast 500? There could be a negative, there was a negative reaction before, and so they're trying to determine what they need to do to get over that, because clearly these hotels and bed and breakfasts need these people to come back in numbers if they can.
I know, absolutely. And the data so far shows that a significant majority of people are very worried about going to large public gatherings.
Yeah.
And a significant minority are very worried about going to pubs and restaurants. And basically going to these sorts of places at all. Travel's an interesting one in terms of there's both whether people will want to travel, and then how they'll be welcomed, as you say, when they rock up. Speaking as somebody who's supposed to be going on a holiday in mid-July to the Moray Coast, and I've just been informed that I have to go, or we'll lose our money basically. It's a thing that's going through my mind at the moment as well, how much the local community will sort of welcome us coming to the area. I think all of the evidence shows that people will generally be quite wary. Some people will be okay with it, but I think there's going to be definitely a drop-off in demand. I think this idea that people won't go abroad, so they'll go away in Scotland, might be true to an extent, but I think it will be outweighed by people's general reluctance to travel just now. And general reluctance to spend their money. So I think it will be a really hard road ahead for the hospitality industry. And this is particularly important in places like the Highlands and Islands, where it forms such a large part of the economy. And it is one of the main employers of young people.
Yeah.
And you're trying to keep young people in the area because they have all of the issues of demographic change and aging population. So it kind of compounds some of the challenges that some of these rural areas were facing already. I think it's a real concern. And, ideally, for me personally, it would be a focus of both central and local government to support some of these communities to make sure they don't lose kind of anchor businesses.
Thank you, Lawrence, for that one. Thank you, Mary. And so, Ralph, do you want to share a wee bit about what you were talking about in the chat about the RSA?
Yeah, I'm leading for RSA Scotland on the promotion of community bank for Scotland on the model of the CSBA, which are trying to set up community banks in 19 regions across the UK, 4 of which are well into their licence applications with the FSA down south, southwest Wales, which is supported by the Welsh Government, northwest and Avon. Are in their licence applications. We're still trying to pull a small steering group together up here, having a bit of difficulty because I've talked to some very senior bankers who've recently stepped back from full-time careers in banking, and every single one of them has said, I've just got out, I don't want back in. But we're now talking to, we have been talking to the Scottish Government, who are interested but have no capacity at the moment because of everything is devoted to setting up SNIB, the National Investment Bank. And until that's operational in December, they've said they don't have capacity. But what we are now doing is talking to North Ayrshire Council with their new wealth building team, and they've all volunteered to take the lead in taking the idea around the other councils. Because quite a lot of the ones that are beginning to plan seriously down south, where they've got their initial money from is from local authority pension funds. Because while the bank would be a cooperative mutual owned by its members, the finance comes in via preference shares, which after the bank becomes profitable 4 or 5 years out, offer a return of 7%, which is obviously very attractive to the pension funds. So hopefully you'll begin to see a lot more about that in the weeks and months ahead.
That's really interesting, and I see you said, you know, about the response of some of the banks during the crisis, and people being quite critical of that, and really leading to, well, you know, the launch of the bounce back scheme, where the government covered 100% of the guarantee. Only then were banks really willing to fire on and get the money out the door, which was a bit disappointing, if a bit predictable. I think your initiative sounds really interesting. I mean, we do a lot of work with that team in North Ayrshire Council, just in general, and they are quite good at being pathfinders for other local authorities on lots of different things. I know North Ayrshire doesn't have its challenges to seek, but they do seem quite willing to embrace new policy ideas, perhaps because of that. So yeah, I think that's really interesting, and it'd be interesting to hear more about it, and perhaps talk to the team in North Ayrshire about it as well.
If is your email on the site, Mari? Because if so, I'll send you some docs.
Yep, that is, yeah.
I'll do that.
Please
do. All after this, Ralph, as well. Yeah, good. Aidan, you had a wider question you wanted to ask?
Yeah, Mari, thanks very much for this so far. It's a wider question in terms of whether Fraser of Allander has got a view on this. I'm conscious, clearly we're all conscious, that the level of debt that is being built up at UK government level is going to be historically high, while at the same time coming out of Benny Higgins' report and recommendations recommending that Scotland should have a much greater borrowing power as well. And at the same time as that, an increasing view coming from the world markets that pound sterling needs to be treated more as a developing country currency, rather than being kept in the basket of the Big Five or the G7. And I just wonder, in terms of when you start to look at just the level of debt that ultimately has to be either placed in the market and repaid, what other levers, or what levers are we going to be able to pull to try to help to get out of this crisis, when everyone is asking for more support at the moment, longer levels of support for good reason, but at the same time, when does the crunch point come where the confidence in UK debt starts to wane and gets much more expensive?
So that's a really good question. It's very hard to answer, so thanks. But
it's an exam question. It's just one of the,
yeah.
I think, the big conundrum.
It is, absolutely. I mean, I think all of the signs are at the moment that the UK government are not going to be shy about continuing to borrow in the short term to support the economy through. And the Bank of England are going to continue to use the monetary policy levers it can to be quite expansionary. So I think that all of the signs are that that's going to continue. In terms of the Scottish angle and the Benny Higgins report and the calls for more borrowing powers for the Scottish government, obviously the Scottish government does have quite limited borrowing powers at the moment, and they're focused on borrowing for capital investment. Its ability to manage a short-term crisis like this, particularly if they have higher social security spending than they thought, or their stamp duty receipts go off a cliff, these sorts of in-year issues, is quite limited, and it does pose some challenges for them, absolutely. However, it's worth saying the UK government have borrowed huge amounts of money on the Scottish government's behalf, and £3.5 billion in consequentials has come to the Scottish government as a result, which is spent in broadly the same way. I will say, when I heard Benny Higgins getting interviewed about the report, he sort of said, well, I don't really care who borrows the money as long as somebody spends it and infrastructure is invested in. So whilst it's been taken as a call for the Scottish government to have more borrowing powers, I'm not entirely sure that that's quite right, in terms of he wants the money to be spent, but not necessarily by the Scottish government. The other thing that I'd say is that your overall question is really, really hard to answer. I think, to be honest, there's going to be quite a level of tolerance for a high level of debt for a number of years to come. And that the UK government are sort of banking on that. And I don't think that the UK government are going to be keen about giving the Scottish government a lot more borrowing powers, given that they take that macro risk on. It seems to me a no-brainer from a political and policy point of view that if the UK government want to spend more money in Scotland, they're going to want to borrow to spend more money in Scotland. They're going to want to make it clear that it's them that's spending that money, rather than giving the Scottish government more leeway to borrow when they take the risk on of what the markets think about that. So I didn't really answer your question, but I can't really, so I just dodged it.
I say it's probably impossible to answer at this stage. I just think it's going to be an interesting dynamic, because the pressure that everyone on Scotland is feeling as well is in terms of how much more support and how much longer does it need to be, literally on a no holds barred basis, as we plough our way out of this, with or without a second wave. And at the end of the day, the key industries in Scotland, because we do have an unbalanced economy from that perspective, are disproportionately affected. So the hospitality in particular, the Highlands and Islands, etc., the points that have already been made. My concern is a tightening of the strings rather than the loosening of the strings in the short term, simply because the pound comes under more pressure. And that would be something that the Chancellor would have to take account of in terms of just the continued proliferation of borrowing.
Yeah, and we've been asked what the reaction might be to these higher levels of of borrowing, in terms of what the fiscal response will be after we get through the crisis. Are we in for more austerity? Are we in for tax rises? But tax rises are just another form of austerity. Really, it's just the redistribute. It's just a different way of redistributing the money. So. Because that acts as a brake on economic growth as well. So really, sort of investing to grow our economy is the way to to get out of this in the long term. So we'll see if the government does that in order to. But it is. You're right. It is only going to work as long as the markets take the view that it's acceptable for the UK government to do so.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Niall, I can see you. Anyone else who's not got their camera on?
No, I'm just still thinking about that currency question, because that's my role is to look at foreign exchange and stuff. And I was just thinking that I think it will be. I think it's been reviewed whether sterling can command the presence that it has in the international markets, but my personal view is that it will be. It absolutely will be. Actually, it's still going to be a G5, G3 if you really want it to be, because whatever is said and done, safe haven status, which kind of an order of priority comes from like dollar to yen, Swiss, but sterling is up there in that safe haven ranking of order. Even the physical location of just London and the ability to trade between east and west, that you can't replace that, right? You can't replace the physical location. So I think the currency is always going to be quite a prominent player in the international markets. I don't think it's going to be downgraded. And I suppose we're all in the same boat in a way. So actually all economies are suffering in a similar fashion. It's unprecedented that every economy is getting hit. Mm-hmm. It's the reaction of how each of those economies then come out of it, and how, or whether it's a V or W or whatever shape curve. Well, my personal view is sterling is here to stay, for sure. Whether we have a Scottish currency,
one of the things that this shows is the flexibility that having your own currency gives you, which is obviously welcome in terms of the UK government's ability to raise money. So I
was part of a bit of work about looking at whether or not a Scottish currency was even conceivable, and I think it came back down to the central bank power that people like when I did the report, people like RBS and that were here, and actually to have a central bank a bank of last resort, you need a pretty big bank just to cover the banks that are here, let alone the rest of the economy. So to have a bank that can support a currency will be very, very difficult, and therefore we resort back to Central Bank of London in the inverted commas anyway. So yeah, I think we're a little bit off a Scottish currency. Good night. Good night.
We're going to start. Don't tell me we're going to start talking about constitutional issues.
Well, there you go. Let's make another call.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? No, I think that's it. I think everybody's saying I wish we had a crystal ball, and thank you so much, Mary. These were pretty difficult questions and some of the topics raised there, so thank you very much for your time and for sharing your presentation with us. We're going to share some of these research reports links. Mary's going to share them with me afterwards, and I can share them with this group as well as a copy of the recording. So we'll leave it there, and thank you so much for your time and joining us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Mary. Bye.